This is Grape Video 40, Vineyard Site Selection Part 2, Choosing Your Vineyard Site within a Viticultural Region. In our previous video, Video 39, we covered the global view of vineyard site selection and talked about the conditions that are conducive to grape growing worldwide. In this presentation, we will talk specifically about issues that will help you choose your vineyard site within a particular viticultural region. If you're trying to grow grapes in a non-traditional area for grapes, you're going to have to use a different approach than what we're talking about here. You're going to have to look at the types of temperature patterns that we presented for the worldwide view in Grape Video 39. But let's start here, proceed to help you choose your vineyard site within a viticultural region. Mezoclimate, that's the way I pronounce it, or maybe Mezoclimate for others. Let's redefine that. We presented it in video 39, but let's refresh our memory. It's the localized climate of a very specific parcel of land. It's the climate of that particular field or that particular slope on the side of a hillside. The question we're trying to answer is a specific parcel of land within a viticultural region suitable for a vineyard? Is it suitable for your vineyard? Before we proceed with other information, let's review some statements that relate to vineyard site selection. Number 1, the first decision you make when starting a new vineyard may be the most important decision in the life of that vineyard. The decision of where to plant the vineyard. Even within a suitable viticultural region, often less than 10% of the land is likely to be a good vineyard site. So do your homework and take the time to find the proper place to plant your grapevines. You have one chance to get it right. If you rush into it, you will live with that wrong choice for the whole life of the vineyard. Make the effort. Make the effort up front when you start a vineyard to choose a proper vineyard site. There is seldom, if ever, a perfect vineyard site. Several years ago, I knew a gentleman who searched for a vineyard site to plant vines, and he was so very intent on getting it just right. He spent several years looking at many sites in many counties throughout Michigan. And in the end, he never decided on any site. He never planted any grapevines. He never grew any grapes. So if you're looking for perfection, you probably won't find it in a vineyard site. Which brings up number 6. When you have chosen a suitable vineyard site, recognize and plan around the deficiencies of that site, because there's likely to be some, but you can work your way around it. You can adjust your plan for the vineyard around the deficiencies of a vineyard site as long as that site is a reasonably decent one. We're going to start the story of vineyard site selection with this cube of air. This cube has 80% nitrogen, that's the yellow asterisks, and then the remaining 20% is mostly oxygen, that's 19%, and then the little dot in the lower right corner is all the minor gases like carbon dioxide and argon and so forth. But just conceptually picture this cube of air with those molecules, and when we cool that air through thermal contraction, when it cools down, it gets smaller and denser like this. And this is true of all matter, not just air, of course. And when it gets contracted like that, with the molecules closer together, it's heavier, it's denser. Well, the reverse would be true. If we expand the air by warming it, it gets less dense or lighter. But we're concerned about what happens to air in a vineyard situation when it starts to get colder and denser. So here's the vineyard. We have put some trees above and below this 6-row vineyard on a gentle slope. And here's our block of air, and here it is when it's gotten colder and denser and heavier. And when it's heavier than the air around it, it wants to fall. It falls down and it sits along the ground like this, and from there it's going to continue going downhill, if you will, just like water would flow downhill during a big rainstorm. Well, what happens? If we have hedges or a wooded area below the vineyard, it's going to act like a dam to collect and hold back the flow of that air down the slope. And it's going to do something like this. So we've got cold air blocked from moving downhill, and you can see in the schematic it's starting to affect the lower row of the vineyard. If there's a lot of cold air, it can go up into the vineyard even more. And that cold air, whether it's during the winter, during the spring, during the fall, can affect the grapevine in bad ways that we'll talk about. Well, if we have a hedge or woods upslope, it will also act as a dam, and it'll keep the cold air that's coming down from the slope further up from the vineyard from going into the vineyard. So that's a good thing. We'd like to keep that cold air from entering the vineyard. Let's take out that hedgerow or the trees below the vineyard like this, and then let's see what happens. Here's the cold air on the ground, and when it flows, it's not obstructed by the trees or shrubs, so it goes down to the very lowest place that it can find. We would call that a freeze or frost pocket, a low area where the coldest, densest air flows, and happily, it doesn't stay in the vineyard and it doesn't hurt our vineyard. But we're going to see how this concept of air as it gets colder and denser flowing downhill has so much to do with the suitability of a parcel of land for a vineyard site. In cool climate viticulture, which is what I'm familiar with, and this is what this presentation is about. I can't speak for warm climate viticulture. I have no experience in that. But in my 45 years in cool climate vineyards, there's things that occur all year long that are not good with cool temperatures in a cool climate vineyard. So, in viticultural regions where there is inadequate heat, it may cause stress to the vine. In the winter, we can have injury to the vine or outright death of the vine if the temperatures get too low. In the spring, we can have freezes that can reduce or even eliminate the entire crop when the vine is just starting to grow, and then we have a freeze, and we'll show you those situations. In the summer, if we have an inadequate heat, we talked in the last video about growing degree days for heat units. If we have inadequate heat to satisfactorily and develop and ripen the crop in the summer, not a good thing. And similar to the spring, in the fall we can have freezes that destroy leaf area and crop before the fruit is satisfactorily ripened. So all year long, in a cool climate situation, there are things that inadequate heat can do negatively to our vineyard, and we want to be aware of that when we pick the site for our vineyard. I'm going to say then that the most important physical factor when choosing a vineyard site within a viticultural region is topography. Topography. Topography has so much to do with the success of our vineyard, and we're going to try to demonstrate that. By topography, I mean within a viticultural region. I don't mean just anywhere. Here is a picture of the Austrian Alps in very, very northern Italy, the Trentino region. And this is not a grape growing area. There are no grapevines here. So it isn't topography itself, it's topography within a viticultural region that has so very much to do with the suitability of a site for a vineyard. See this? This is a not so good situation in the spring. The vines in the swale and the low spot and in the foreground are very sick or dead. And we have to ask ourselves every time we plant a vineyard the important question, and that question is, does your proposed vineyard site import or export cold air? Seems simple, but it's oh so important. Topography influences winter minimum temperatures. Here's that same picture again. Look in the background. See the higher ground that exports cold air into the lower part of the vineyard? The vines there are much healthier than the ones in the swale and in the foreground, because that section exports cold air and the sections in the foreground import cold air. And it made all the difference in the amount of winter injury to these vines. Similarly, just down the road on the same day, here's another vineyard, and you can see that the vines in the foreground are very sick, or many of them dead. You can get a little better picture as you go up the hill, where the uphill part of the vineyard is exporting cold air during the winter down into the low spot in the foreground. So the good vineyard site is up above, and the grower planted this vineyard too low down the slope to where the cold air collected and killed his vines during the previous winter. Here's another example. This is a Niagara vineyard, juice grape vineyard, and this is a so-called frost pocket or freeze pocket. It's the low spot from all directions, so that from the left and the right, from the background, the foreground, cold air in midwinter was falling down those slopes and landed in this very low spot and severely injured. Didn't kill the vines. It looks like it may have, but it took about 2 years for these vines to recover, but they did. But winter injury in the frost pocket because that location was importing cold air. Well, when we don't have nice sloping ground, if we don't have suitable topography for exporting cold air, at times we try to make up for it with situations like this. Whether it be spring freeze or here in the wintertime, when the air gets too cold, we try to move that cold air out of the vineyard. We try to bring in warmer air that's up higher. There's higher you go over the vineyard, often there'll be warmer air aloft, and you try to bring it down to the vine level with wind machines like this, and it's partially effective. But when you see a vineyard like this, on a slope like this, and this is in the Finger Lakes region of New York, this is overlooking Keuka Lake. Some of these vineyards are well over 100 years old, have been productive for a very long period of time. They export the cold air down the slope to the woods below, and then eventually out onto the frozen lake below. And here's a picture on the other side of that lake. Same idea. Sloping ground, exporting cold air down and away from the vines. Oh, this is a beautiful vineyard. This is on Old Mission Peninsula near Traverse City, Michigan. And this is a beautiful example of a vineyard site that exports cold air. The two gentlemen in the foreground are standing where there's about 4 rows of vines, and it's gently sloping like this. And at the end of the arrow, it's almost like a cliff. It's very steep, goes down about 75 feet, and it goes to the section of vineyard below. And that section is sloping from right to left like this. And you can well imagine when there's cold air that it flows like a waterfall and out of these vineyards, and it winds up down here by this red dot. And maybe you can tell, or maybe you can't, that's a tennis court complex down there. We don't really care about the cold air down there. So it goes down to the tennis courts and then gradually filters through the trees and out into the water that's part of Lake Michigan. It creates Old Mission Peninsula. What a beautiful vineyard site. In contrast, in southwest Michigan, this is one of many old Concord vineyards on flat ground, and it does have many problems, mostly in the springtime. Because of the flat ground, we get a significant spring freeze, sometimes winter injury, about 1 every 3 years. Well, topography not only influences the winter minimum temperatures, but the growing season length, and it does it by the occurrence of spring and fall freezes. Here's a Concord grapevine shoot about 1.5 to 2 inches long, and that is vulnerable to a freeze when the temperatures are 26 to 28 degrees roughly in the spring. So if we don't have the right conditions and the growth starts on these vines, and then we get temperatures plummeting below freezing, this is what happens. See how this site is relatively flat? Yeah, the cold air on a spring night just stayed right there, didn't go anywhere. It wasn't exported out of the vineyard, and we lost the crop for the year pretty much in one night. Well, we do things at times. We showed you wind machines. At times we can use overhead irrigation to try to make up for the deficiency of a vineyard site when it's not exporting cold air. This is at our MSU Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center, and this is a Concord vineyard. I love taking pictures. It's kind of morbidly beautiful when we have a spring freeze event and we put on the overhead irrigation and we get all kinds of beautiful icicles forming. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, we're probably at risk of losing the crop, but it does take a nice picture. There we are. Boy, oh boy. Well, we wait until mid-morning and the icicles start to melt, and we know we've made it through the episode. But in the meantime, we've encased those small developing shoots in ice, and we're not going to go over the technology of protecting vines with overhead irrigation in this video, perhaps some other video another time. But if we do it just right, we can encase those emerging shoots in ice and continue to put water on to liberate heat, and we can bring that crop through the episode without injury, and it'll go on to develop like this. But we wouldn't have had to have done that had we a vineyard site that had enough air drainage to take the cold air out of that relatively flat vineyard site in the first place. So this is kind of remedial, making up for the deficiency of the site when we do things like this. It's a picture I took many years ago of a California vineyard, and it illustrates that a big flat area like this in the spring is not the ideal situation to protect against the spring freeze. And similarly, here is a big flat area with Concord and Niagara grapevines in southwest Michigan, and as I said earlier, we get spring freezes on this acreage about 1 every 3 years. So that grower has a barn full of fans that he attaches to his PTO on tractors to try to move the air, the cold air, out of the vineyard when there's a spring freeze event. But once again, that's making up for the deficiency of that vineyard site and trying to do something mechanically that would occur naturally if we had adequate slope, adequate topography in the vineyard. Well, those were photos of spring freeze events. The same thing can happen in the fall. The growing season can end early by a freeze that occurs before we're ready to pick the crop. It's perhaps not ripe enough, and perhaps we haven't been able to get to it because of the harvest schedule. Anyway, here's some Concord grapes with the leaves frozen. There's going to be no more development of sugars in those grapes because the leaves are gone. If we're lucky, there's enough maturation of the fruit that we can go ahead and pick it. The grapes after the first freeze are typically still quite sound and capable of being harvested. However, sometimes the fruit just hasn't ripened enough and we lose the crop entirely because of inadequate fruit maturity, poor quality of fruit that isn't marketable, and it sits on the vine and eventually falls on the ground, as you can see it here. So this is the real life story of the importance of choosing a proper vineyard site that does not end your growing season prematurely early in the fall. Here's the different story though. This is a Riesling vineyard near the Traverse City area of Michigan, and we're late in the fall, perhaps even early November. You can see in the background the trees have almost lost their leaves, and we have a gradually senescing leaf area on these Riesling vines. You can see how the shoots are now nicely turning brown with periderm to be fully ripened. The fruit is fully ripened because there has been no early fall freeze on these vines. And you might be able to detect that there is a slope to this site that goes from left to right, and we're happy picking grapes late in the fall. Looks almost the same here, but this is Chardonnay in southwest Michigan. Same idea, a good location where we picked this crop weeks ago, and post-harvest is going on with the maturation of the vines, preparing them for a cold winter ahead. And I throw in yet another picture late in the fall in the Finger Lakes region of an old vineyard, but look at those leaves turning senescent yellow and falling off naturally rather than being frozen off early in the fall season because of that nice sloping ground. And lastly, this is a hillside we're going to talk about in great detail, but here we are, the 9th of November, and we don't have brown leaves on those vines. No, they're senescing gradually way into the fall. This is Cabernet Sauvignon on a south-facing slope, and you can see the woods to the left is pretty much lost more than half of its leaf area already. It's that late in the fall, and those Cabernet Sauvignon vines on the slope with that good topography, exporting that cold air, are producing a late season crop of Cabernet Sauvignon. Okay, topography then also influences the growing season heat. The growing degree days that we talked about in video 39. Here we are on that Cab Sauvignon slope once again, and you can see that we are still having a growing season of sorts. Even though the leaves are getting quite senescent, there's still some function going on. And we ask ourselves, do the slope and aspect of your proposed vineyard site allow you to experience a longer, warmer growing season than the parcels of land surrounding your proposed vineyard site? Very important, very important. Here we are up in that vineyard looking down. See how the corn has been frosted down in the low flat area? We're going to talk about that in detail. But up here on the hillside with the very steep ground, we can see that the Cab Sauvignon is still hanging, still going through some ripening late in the fall. If we had it down in the valley, everything would have been brown and dead by now. Let's take a look at one of those clusters. That happens to be a south-facing aspect. That is to say, the slope is facing south. And on sunny days, even late in the fall, the fruit gets well exposed to sunlight. And that's important because we want heat on that fruit to help metabolize away the high acid levels and reduce them to an acceptable level. It's amazing. Solar radiation on a berry surface can raise the temperature of a grape berry by as much as 23 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 13 degrees Celsius, above the ambient air temperature. That's amazing. I have measured up to a 14-degree difference, but the literature says at times as much as 23 degrees Fahrenheit difference between the temperature of the berry and the ambient air temperature. So even as we go into a cool fall period and we have a cool sunny day, the fruit can be a lot warmer than you might imagine, and it can be helping to mature that fruit. And that is a function of topography. And while we're at it, the best aspects for absorbing heat from the sun are south and west, not as good north or east. But you can have a good vineyard with any aspect. We have wonderful vineyards at times that have their slope to the north, to the east. The preferable slope, however, would be to the west or south to maximize the solar radiation on your fruit. in the fall. So let's say in conclusion, the most important physical factor when choosing a vineyard site within a cool climate viticultural region is, and you know what I'm about to say, topography, topography, topography. Well, in our next video, we're going to take a very in-depth look at a small valley in southwest Michigan, and we're zooming through that valley at about 4 times normal speed. It'll take us about a minute of this jerky video to go across this about 4/10 of a mile or 7/10 of a kilometer. If we did it normal speed, it would take us 4, 5, 6 minutes. So we zoomed up just to give you the idea that we're going to show you in very detailed ways how the sites along this route are so very different in their suitability for a vineyard. This is a Golden Delicious orchard we're zooming through, and we're coming up through what is now an abandoned vineyard, and we're going to show you with lots of summary data. We accumulated over 11 years over 1 million data points, hourly data temperatures in this little valley, and we're going to have that all summarized to show you exactly what is good and not so good about parts of this small valley. And there we are in about a minute making a quick trip. That's one of the sensors we have here. And then when we finish this video on the valley, as I'm calling it, we're going to talk about the importance of soils in the next video for vineyard site selection. And then if you're a backyard grape grower and you don't need all this detail and you just want to plant a few vines in your backyard, we're going to have a short video on the importance of choosing the right conditions for your vineyards in the backyard vineyard. So we'll end for now, and as always we'll say happy grape growing, and thank you for your attention.